Hello, everybody. My name is Mike Gaudette, and welcome back to another installment of Top 5 Albums, the series where I walk you through my 5 favorite albums from every year. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about the year 1975, and we've now reached the midpoint of the 70s, and initially when I started this series, I started with the year 1965, and to see how much music has changed and continued to evolve over this 10-year period is really amazing. And as we get closer to the 80s, we're going to see even more significant shifts in sound and different styles of music. But a lot of those changes won't happen for a couple more years, and I would say 1975 very much sounds like a continuation of a lot of the sounds and styles that were established in the earlier part of the 70s. And this was another very solid year for 70s music. So without further ado, here are my top 5 favorite albums of 1975, starting with number 5. Okay, coming in at number 5 is Still Crazy After All These Years by Paul Simon. I'm a big Simon & Garfunkel and Paul Simon fan, and when we're talking Paul Simon's solo discography, I would regard this record as, one of the top 2, maybe top 3 records of his entire discography. I will say that I don't think this is a perfect album. It does have a couple of moments here and there that I would regard as very slight dips in momentum, but I do think the overwhelming majority of this album is incredible, and as far as the songwriting goes, this would definitely contain the largest amount of my favorite solo Paul Simon songs. And I do think the types of songs that he wrote and his sense of harmony evolved into even deeper territories on this record. I think the entirety of side 1 is absolutely perfect from front to back. It's got incredible tracks like 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover, I Do It For Your Love, My Little Town, and the title track, Still Crazy After All These Years, which very well might be my number 1 favorite Paul Simon song. And then side 2 sort of veers off into some different stylistic territories, and in my opinion, it doesn't contain that same cohesive sound that side 1 does, but there are still some very nice individual tracks throughout this side, like the song Have a Good Time, which is one of my favorite feel-good Paul Simon tracks, and I also love the closing track, Silent Eyes, which has some beautiful and dark piano work, and concludes the album on such an intense and emotional mood, which I think is very tasteful. And like I said, do I think it's a perfect album? Not necessarily, but I do think the overwhelming majority of the tracks on here are great, and I do think there are so many exceptional individual tracks, and like I said, some of my favorite songs of Paul Simon's entire solo discography, which really carry the majority of this record for me. And after looking at all of the other albums on my 1975 list and trying to narrow it down to a top 5, this one consistently kept popping up as the main contender for the number 5 spot. So obviously, I really enjoy this album, and it does have a special place in my heart, even if I wouldn't say it's a perfect record from front to back. So that is my number 5 album. Now on to number 4. Okay, coming in at number 4 is The Hissing of Summer Lawns by Joanie Mitchell, an absolutely amazing record by an incredible songwriter, and this is an album that would continue off of the stylistic changes that she had made on the previous record, Court and Spark, where she started doing more jazz and rock sorts of combinations. And this album picks up from there, but also ventures into even more unexplored territories with this great fusion of jazz, rock, folk, and even some experimental elements coming in. It's got amazing production, incredible songwriting, rich instrumentations, and amazing guest features such as Larry Carlton, James Taylor, Graham Nash, Robin Ford, and David Crosby, among many others. And each of these guest features adds really nice, unique, individual touches to the songs that they are featured on. And this album would also feature the most experimental Joanie Mitchell song up to this point, which is the track titled The Jungle Line, which has some really wild sounds going on in the percussion section. And it's a really cool song that very clearly illustrates that Joanie was veering off into even more unexplored territories and really starting to take some more chances on this record. And I think all 10 tracks on here have a little bit for everybody. We have some of the folk elements that are more similar to the earlier Joanie Mitchell albums, but we also have some more of those jazz and rock elements that we had heard on Court and Spark, as well as some of the more experimental elements that are newer to what she had been doing up to that point. And I think there is just so much depth all throughout this track listing. My favorite songs on here would be Edith and the Kingpin, Harry's House, Shades of Scarlet Conquering, and the beautiful closing track, Shadows and Light, which wraps the album up on a beautiful and powerful note with a track that is mostly a cappella, and vocally and lyrically it is just so beautiful and rich and concludes the album in the most satisfying way possible. So an amazing album, and it would definitely be a contender for my top 5 favorite Joanie Mitchell albums. And if you are interested in hearing more about my thoughts on Joanie Mitchell, I do have a video where I ranked her entire discography. So if you're interested in that, check out the tier list playlist, which I will have linked in the comments and the description. So that is my number 4 album. Now on to number 3. All right, coming in at number 3 is Face the Music by Electric Light Orchestra. I love everything that's going on throughout this, continuing on that orchestral rock trajectory that they had established on the previous album, El Dorado, but also veering off into some more pop rock directions, and that fusion of pop rock and orchestral rock would define the sound that Electric Light Orchestra is most well known for. And it also has a couple of tracks that contain some more progressive rock elements, which would be more similar to the sounds that we heard on the earlier part of the ELO discography. So stylistically, we're getting a little bit of everything that ELO has to offer up to that point, and I think they did it very effectively, and it's packaged in a very cohesive manner. The album is 8 tracks long with 4 songs on each side, and I love every single song. I do not think it has one skip over track. And I think the blend in styles and the variety from track to track makes for a very fun, adventurous, and almost cinematic sort of listening experience with all very high quality ELO tracks, and a few that would definitely make my list of top ELO songs with tracks like Strange Magic, Night Rider, Waterfall, and Evil Woman. And I think this was the record where Jeff Lynne really achieved that orchestral rock and progressive rock combination and picked up where he had left off on El Dorado in the best way possible, and produced one of the top records of ELO's discography, in my opinion. And if you're interested in hearing my full thoughts on ELO's discography, I also have a video where I rank all of their albums, so be sure to check that out in the tier list playlist, which will be linked in the comments and the description. So that is my number 3 album. Now on to number 2. Okay, coming in at number 2 is Wish You Were Here by Pink Floyd, an incredible album from one of my all-time favorite bands, and this one goes down as my second favorite record of their discography. A perfect album, in my opinion, and it's only 5 tracks long, but they pack so much great music within that 5-song track listing, and this is one of those records where as I listen through it, it almost plays through like a greatest hits album, with Shine On You Crazy Diamond, Welcome to the Machine, Have a Cigar, and Wish You Were Here. These are all just incredible and classic Pink Floyd tracks, and they are all just back-to-back on the track listing of this album, which is unbelievable in my opinion. Shine On You Crazy Diamond opens the album up beautifully with this really nice, spacey, psychedelic, stretched out track, which is a very powerful and emotional tribute to Syd Barrett. Then Welcome to the Machine veers off into the more dark and ominous side of Pink Floyd, an amazing track that has all of those eerie Roger Waters elements all throughout it. Have a Cigar then gives us a taste of the more rocking side of Pink Floyd, and then Wish You Were Here gives us the softer acoustic side of Pink Floyd. So I think stylistically we're getting all of the best sides of Pink Floyd, and there's a lot of great variety from one track to the next. And in my opinion, the combination of all of these amazing songs produced one of the best albums of Pink Floyd's entire discography. And yeah, I cannot say enough good things about this album, and it was a super easy choice putting it in my number 2 spot. So now for the grand reveal, here is my number 1 favorite album of 1975. Okay, coming in at number 1 is Jim Hall Live, and this is a record that I am willing to bet a lot of people have never heard of before, and this is not an album that a ton of people are aware of unless you're a big fan of jazz guitar. And as a jazz guitarist myself, this album has always held a special place in my heart, and it would definitely go down as my top 2, maybe top 3 favorite jazz guitar trio albums of all time. This is just a perfect live recording that captured this trio on a very magical night where there was so much amazing stuff happening between the three of them. We have Jim Hall on guitar, Don Thompson, who is an amazing Canadian musician playing bass, and Terry Clark on drums. And the album has a very nicely chosen selection of 5 different jazz standards that showcase all of the beauty that this trio is capable of creating. There is so much beautiful interaction between all 3 of them, and they all know how to use space very effectively, which is something that's very refreshing, and I really appreciate it about this trio. And Jim Hall is delivering some of the most beautiful and lyrical guitar solos that he's ever created. Again, somebody who uses space in a very effective manner, and something that I think really separates him from a lot of other guitar players, and one of the things that makes his playing so lyrical. Jim Hall would easily go down as one of my favorite jazz guitarists, and I love the song selection and the interpretations that they did on each of them. The opening track, Angel Eyes, would have to be my favorite song from this album, and I love the contrasting tempos that they did throughout this. Having 3 mid to down-tempo tracks with Angel Eyes, Round Midnight, and The Way You Look Tonight, and then Scrapple from the Apple and I Hear a Rhapsody pick the tempo up and give some nice bursts of energy throughout the track listing. And this is a record that I never get tired of listening to. This trio has so much depth, and they create so many beautiful moments throughout this album. And for anybody who is looking to explore more jazz guitar albums, I would consider this one to be essential listening, and I highly recommend it. So that is my number 1 favorite album of 1975. So to recap, at number 5, we had Still Crazy After All These Years by Paul Simon. At number 4, we had The Hissing of Summer Lawns by Joanie Mitchell. Number 3 was Face the Music by Electric Light Orchestra. Number 2 was Wish You Were Here by Pink Floyd. And number 1 was Jim Hall Live by the Jim Hall Trio. If you haven't heard any of these records and you check them out, please be sure to let me know your thoughts in the comments, and I would also love to see what your top 5 favorite albums of 1975 are, so please let me know in the comments. Alright, that is it for today. Thank you so much for watching, and stay tuned for my top 5 favorite albums of 1976. I will see you then. Take care.